Welcome back to the final part of this little festival that we're doing outside here. So we're getting close to the cocktail hour, so the conversation is getting a little bit more perhaps informal. And we felt this would be a good opportunity to talk not so much about the research being done at the Institute, but perhaps take a kind of slightly more general perspective and talk about some of the opportunities and challenges in research practices. So what does it means to be a scientist, a scholar? What are the kind of things that are changing, and what are the impacts this has on the academic world in general, perhaps also to the rest of the society, but particularly I think here at the Institute. You know, in many ways I think the Institute always has been a laboratory not only of ideas but also of practices. In some sense, the whole idea of a postdoctoral scholar in some sense was kind of born here in the 1940s. So there are many ways that the Institute was kind of ahead of the curve. So we have a kind of a very learned panel here with us. Again, representatives of all 4 schools. We have June from mathematics. Scott Tremaine, astrophysics, Nicola Cosmo from the School of Historical Studies, East Asian Studies, and Johan Heilbron, a member in the School of Social Sciences. So we prepared a little bit, but not too much. Certainly I think this is a topic where we'd like to have your input. And I think we want to kind of start. I asked each 4 of the panelists to highlight something which I think they see as kind of key element in how the world is changing in academics and how we are dealing with it. And I didn't say in advance in which order I'm going to ask the questions, so I see some anxious looks there. But let me start with you, Scott. Perhaps you can start by sharing your idea, and then we'll have a discussion about it.
Sure. Well, as everybody knows, there's been a lot of discussion in the political and economic spheres about growing wealth inequality in the U.S. and other countries, by which I mean simply that a larger and larger fraction of the wealth is concentrated in a small segment of the population. And I think one of the challenges we face is in research in general is the question of whether a larger and larger fraction of the research capability is being concentrated in a smaller and smaller fraction of the researchers and the institutions. I think there's plenty of evidence that the answer is yes. One reason is the declining role in this country of the federal government in funding research. Some examples, the annual support for the mathematical sciences from the Simons Foundation is now about 1/3 of the total federal support for mathematics through the National Science Foundation. Another example is the largest institute in theoretical physics in the world now is the Perimeter Institute in Canada, which is a private institution founded by an entrepreneur who still takes an active role in directing the general research focus of the institute. From my own field, the next generation of large telescopes, all of the access for U.S. astronomers for those telescopes will come either from a couple of state governments, from foreign partners, and from private donors, with none coming from the federal government. A second trend, I think, and a reason for growing research inequality is the decline in funding for public universities, which we're, I think, all aware of. Not only does this increase the non-research workload for faculty at those universities, but the wealthier universities, like Princeton, are now instituting their own research funds to enable research by their faculty, which puts the researchers at other universities at even more of a disadvantage. I think the final trend that contributes to this inequality is the growing cost and timescale of large experiments, at least in particularly so in physics and astrophysics. In those disciplines now, a large experiment will take between 10 and 20 years between its conception and the first results, and is likely to cost $10 billion or more. A famous example is the James Webb Space Telescope, the successor to the Hubble telescope. When it was first conceived about 20 years ago, until now, its budget has grown by a factor of 10 to 20. Back in 2010, the journal Nature called it the telescope that ate astronomy, because the support for building the telescope had sucked up all of the free funds available and caused cancellation of many other projects. Now, despite that, 8 years later, we've just learned that the telescope is going to be delayed another year and is going to cost even more money. So I think managing those sorts of large projects, unless it's very carefully done, really can have a deleterious effect by concentrating all the resources in a very small number of research subjects. Despite those trends, I think there are some aspects in which research is becoming more egalitarian. We now have preprint servers so that when new results are published, they're available instantly across the world to anybody who has access to the internet. The old boy network that used to be the way that you learned about new research results is completely gone. A researcher in southern India learns about a new discovery at exactly the same time as a researcher at Harvard. Moreover, there are emerging standards that all data coming from publicly funded facilities should be made public to everybody as quickly as possible. In particular, large databases can now be mined for new discoveries by anybody with a laptop, whatever country they're in and whatever funding they've got. And finally, I think the large experiments that I've talked about require large teams with a very diverse set of skills. And when you need diverse set of skills in a project, you tend to hire a more diverse set of researchers. So I think there are optimistic signs. The analogy I've made with society is, of course, not perfect. In my view, anyway, ideal societies are democratic, whereas science is elitist, and research in general is elitist and far from democratic. But I think the research enterprise does share with society the idea that there ought to be the possibility of upward mobility.
So, Scott, do you feel that this is an autonomous process, or what are, in some sense, the drivers? I mean, and in which extent is the academic community itself guilty of this? Is something that is imposed on us, or are we self-inflicting this model?
I think it depends on what aspect we're talking about. I think in terms of the large projects, there's always a certain amount of hubris and ambition in the most successful of our colleagues that lead them to propose large and grandiose projects. But I think there are also drivers within the funding bureaucracy and within the mechanism for publicizing science that drive people towards large projects, even at the expense of smaller ones.
Nicola, can I ask you to perhaps a short reaction to this? Because in humanities, for instance, I don't think you have the effect of these huge collaborations of thousands of people. But I would say you see a similar trend where, perhaps even more sharper, where those places where the humanities are very, generously being supported are often those who have a lot of, large endowments or other opportunities to create these positions themselves.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think for the humanities, certainly we have a different situation from what Scott mentioned, in the sense that I don't know of any project that has ever cost billions of dollars. So the level of, I would like to, yes. So the question is really whether the typical way in which a history book is written is going to be the model of the future, or whether we are going to have more teamwork in the humanities, more interdisciplinarity with other areas, both in the social sciences and in the sciences, and whether these type of projects are going to be funded at all, simply because they cross disciplinary
I want to
boundaries.
come back to the
Yes.
moment, but if you just focus briefly on this theme of inequality, do you see that happening too? That a small number of institutions are, in some sense, more responsible for.
Personally, I don't. Personally, I would say that, of course, there is a disparity among institutions in terms of resources and in terms of libraries, for instance, which is what we use normally, books and manuscripts and epigraphic materials and so forth. But in fact, I haven't seen any single institution that is completely in the lead simply because they are bigger and more famous and richer. I think there is a more democratic, if you want to use this word, spread of, and people from relatively less well-endowed institutions have pretty much the same chances of writing a fundamental book in an area as in others.
I also want to ask Johan. I think the theme this year at the School of Social Science is exactly the sociology. I mean, the social science of the social sciences. So this seems to be an ideal question that kind of just fits in this program. If you think of the social science, do you think of it again as a society? Is the society that's getting less or more equal?
Yes. Well, is it working?
Yes.
Yeah. We did have indeed this theme of the year in the social science school was social science of social science. And so the idea was we use the tools of the social sciences to investigate processes in the social sciences themselves. And this may seem like a sort of little bit of a navel-gazing activity. I mean, here are social scientists studying other social scientists. But I think there are good reasons to dig into these questions. First of all, because the social sciences are obviously part of the object of study of the social sciences. And so they differ in this respect from the natural sciences. I mean, there's no physics of physics or mathematics of mathematics, but there is a social science of social science. It's part of the things we study. And then secondly, it can have a certain significance to do this, to study the social sciences themselves. First of all, because it can sort of clarify the research process, which is of use to anybody who is interested in social science or wants to do social science. So this is usually called reflexivity in the social sciences, that we do not only try to do our research and our work in the social science, but sort of routinely using the standards of research and so forth, but in a reflexive manner that you're conscious of sort of the categories used, the implications, the assumptions, and so forth. And reflexive also in the sense of the broader context within which the work is done. And so this is exactly the issues that Scott brings up that are part of the issues. And I have the impression, I don't have much research, but my impression is also that the concentration of research resources has increased. That the differences within the teaching and research communities in the social science have become bigger. There has been a tendency for a sort of star system, that more money goes to fewer people. So that is, I think, certainly a tendency. And the pushing it a little bit further, this could lead to situations in which economists call winner-take-all situations. And that is for the sort of ecology of the science system and also science education system a very bad thing, of course, because we lose a lot of diversity, plurality, and so forth. So I think, yes, unfortunately, I see the same tendency.
I remember well, we had at some point, Scott, you mentioned Jim Simons and the terrific things doing in mathematics. And yesterday we just celebrated his 80th birthday. It's amazing something what he achieved. And once we had a conference on curiosity-driven research, and he gave a talk with the title Curiosity-Driven Philanthropy. And his first remark was, well, you all might applaud my title, but if you think through, it's actually the worst for you to happen, because if I, as a philanthropist, I'm very curious in one thing, I will support that, but it will not support others. In fact, you want to have a completely disinterested supporter. I want to go back to you, Nicola, and you are about to begin to speak on this topic of interdisciplinarity, which I think is another interesting trend. Can you add to it?
Sure, thank you, Robert. Yes, interdisciplinarity is, I think, integral to the work of a historian. As historians, we always find new ways, try to find new ways to understand, explain the past. And so in the past, historians have used linguistics, for instance, have used archaeology and material culture, have used anthropology. In fact, historians are a little bit like magpies, you know, stealing concepts and ideas from a lot of other places. But now we've reached perhaps a point in which a number of historians are trying to use scientific data. And that is a level of interdisciplinarity that offers a lot of opportunities.
You do this yourself too, right?
And I do that myself too. I've done this for the past 3 or 4 years. And the challenges and opportunities are considerable here. What I do is to use paleo sciences, and in particular paleo climate data, to understand various events and phenomena of the past. What do we mean by paleoclimate sciences? Perhaps we need to explain that those are sciences that study nature and evolution of nature and environments and so on, flora, fauna, etc., in the past, sometimes over millennia. But the development of these sciences in recent years allows us to get data that historians can actually use for their work. That is, they are on a time scale and of a high enough resolution that we can understand changes in climate at various latitudes and regions and so on a yearly and decadal time scale. So that actually helps us to have a richer understanding of a certain event. For instance, we can follow better, perhaps, instances of famines and rebellions, or mortality, or migrations, all these macroscopic events in which climatic changes, cooling, warming, and so forth, may have had a role. Now, the question is, as a historian, how do I get and use these data, which are published in highly specialized scientific journals and are expressed in a language with which I'm not familiar? And there is no hope that I can become a scientist, of course.
So you're very much dependent on the scientists.
Very much dependent on the scientists. So the challenge is, how do we build bridges between the historian and the scientist? How do we create a situation of collaboration and even symbiosis at some level?
Do you feel that on the science side there are people also working on a bridgehead, so to say, to how many scientists do you meet that are interested in the kind of historical questions that you are working on?
They are interested in historical questions because I think to a certain degree their own data acquire better value, a higher degree of value by connecting with social changes, economic changes in the past, and understanding actually how climatic variability has an impact on societies and on people. But at the same time, I feel that sometimes we are all trapped by our own training, very much so. For instance, climate scientists address historical changes usually in terms of correlations over a long period of time. So if we have a drought, what happens when there is a drought? And does it have an impact on every society in the same way? And of course,
and you're interested in specific events, I can imagine.
I'm much more interested in case studies,
yes,
rather than because I think a case study can encapsulate much better the impact of specific climatic events, yes, and historical.
June, can I ask you just perhaps to reflect a little bit on this interaction between humanities and mathematics? I'm also asking you because in some sense you're, not everybody might know this, but the path that you took to go into mathematics was also not completely straightforward.
once considered going into humanities,
I know.
and I decided to turn into math. But this transition was very sudden. I mean, because there is this huge gap, and you have to enter the entirely new world to start doing it. And still, say, in between history and math, I cannot imagine whether there could potentially be a meaningful collaboration. I mean, especially because I was trained in that way. And growing up in such a society, it's even hard to imagine what could be possibly done between us, say. So if we can build up a nice
you feel
environment.
you had to reinvent yourself when you went into mathematics?
Oh, I'm too late for that. So we have to reinvent the environment to build a generation who could think that way. Yeah.
That's very good. Can I ask, turn to you, Jun? What did you bring with you as an idea or phenomena that you want to highlight?
So I will talk about the change that has very much to do with what Scott talked about, but I want to talk about this change at a much more personal level, not at the institutional level or our college or something like that. So it seems to me that there's some slow but very certain change that's happening concerning research in pure mathematics. And this change has something to do with technology and computers, but I'm not talking about numerical simulation and not something that costs billions of dollars, for example. But this change do have something to do with use of internets. So I'll talk about this. All this is based on just personal observations as someone who is in between young and old. So here's a hypothetical example. So let's say you have a mathematical statement that may be true or false, and you want to decide which one it is. And you bring it to a mathematician, let's say a traditional mathematician, and give this statement to that mathematician, and probably he will start thinking about it. And if the statement is interesting and at the same time challenging, this process of thinking will go on for days and maybe weeks or maybe even longer. But if you bring the same statement to a mathematician from a younger generation, with very high probability, this person will just open his laptop and type something into Google and see what sort of information he gets. So I'm not trying to suggest that younger people don't think. So let me explain what we are actually doing when we're typing something into Google. So imagine a space consisting of all possible mathematical statements. So some are true, some are not true, maybe some are in between. And this space is so huge, so we can only see a very small part of it at a time. And all these statements are interconnected to each other by this web of implications. And we say that we understood something when we could follow a path of implications starting from a known fact. So when we are given an unknown statement and we are trying to use Google, we are conducting an experiment, a novel concept in pure mathematics. So we try to collect as many relevant statements as possible and first try to see whether all these statements are consistent with the target statement. And if yes, we are trying to identify the nearest known point to start the hike. So, of course, this same experiment has been conducted over the generations, in particular by the masters of the past. But these experiments that were conducted in the past were based on accumulated knowledge and expertise of their colleagues, for example. But nowadays, the same experiment can be performed at a much lower level, so to say. So to a mathematician who are less experienced and maybe someone not working in Princeton or Harvard. So this will have some long-term changes that may be good or bad, because I have heard senior people saying that young generation do not know how to go from point A to point B if you let them not use their cell phone or GPS. So yeah, I don't know what will happen to our mathematical ability in the long run, but it will be interesting to see what will happen.
An intellectual Google Maps, so to say.
Yes.
Can you just ask any of the panelists, do you ever type in something, a search in Google if you have an idea?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. I'm so relieved. So we can all admit to this now. I just want to ask about this because I think in a milder form, the same thing is if you have even a half-baked idea, you talk to a colleague or something. I mean, that's in some sense very similar, right?
Right, right.
And I want to kind of challenge you a little bit because it's also, I think, part of it is, people might think of mathematics as a very, very rigorous discipline. But in some sense, to find a proof or find your way in mathematics, you also need some kind of sense of direction.
Right.
Which is not the same thing as having a proof. It's perhaps intuition or a gut feeling or another way. And would you say that this kind of, that the internet or something helps you to improve your intuition or your sense of directions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a strange notion of distance in this hypothetical space of all statements. So some statements are far away from the known territory. These are the statements that we call difficult. And you cannot go there just by the one step or one implication. So somehow you have to make many small moves, and you have to somehow go in the right direction whenever you are making this move. And which direction to go, that's completely unclear from the beginning. And I guess this is the point where we use our so-called intuition. But compared to the past, I mean, experimenting in a random direction becomes much more easier for the new generation, and we can conduct this experiment much more effectively with or without intuition. So in that sense, I think the new generation will be much more effective in finding their own path.
Can I ask that question, and just any of the panelists feel to respond to this? Does these technologies make us more adventurous, and are we kind of exploring a larger space of ideas? Or is it actually narrowing us down to funnels or something, because that's where the Google search will lead you? Scott, and I know you're thinking about it.
I like to think that it makes us more adventurous, simply because the analog pre-Google was to walk over to the library and try to find a book that contained what you were looking for. And obviously, Google is somewhat more efficient, I think, than most books at finding what you're looking for. So I think it does make us more adventurous.
Is it also more efficient for finding what you're not looking for? In the library, often there's the book next door, right, which next to it, which then triggers your imagination.
The advantage of the library is that you get exposed to something that you weren't looking for, perhaps a little more easily than in Google.
Johan, I know you at some point want to say about something about the quality of books, but before we get to that,
well, maybe I would like to ask a question to you. I can understand it can speed up the process. You can very more quickly and perhaps more efficiently look. But does it change the process itself? Because at a certain point in time, you would have to consult books, the standard knowledge. You would have to talk to people. You would have to sort of organize a process of writing a paper together. And in these, or would it change these aspects as well?
Yeah, maybe, and many people are, I guess, concerned about this because we spend less time thinking before typing something in. And the things that you find by typing something into Google are already known facts. So in that sense, you cannot make a fundamental discovery. So in the previous generation, mathematicians thought about the problem for a very long time deeply, and at some night, some Hindu god appears in your dream and dramatically suggests you a solution. And this is something Google cannot do. So some senior people are worried that although the total number of mathematicians and the total number of research output is growing, the great ones are actually may decrease. So I don't know whether this will actually happen, but there are such concerns.
It's flattening the curve instead of... Scott?
There is at least one counterexample. Many of you will have seen the movie The Man Who Knew Infinity
Yes.
about the Indian mathematician Ramanujan. And I just like to point out that if Google had been around when Ramanujan was working, he just would have posted his thousands of results on Google, and he would have been discovered much sooner, and the community would have discovered his results much faster.
Johan, I want to go to you and what the item for the discussion you have prepared.
Well, among the opportunities of the Institute in our field in the social science, and I think in the humanities as well, is that many of us work on a book project. And this has actually become much more difficult in university settings to find the time to work in a concentrated way on a book, which takes more time and more concentration. And in our disciplines, indeed, books still matter very much. I mean, if you look at citation patterns, in the natural sciences, I think roughly 10% of the references are to books. In the social sciences and the humanities, it's between 1/3 and 2/3. So, you know, in terms of citations, books are very present still. And I think there are good reasons. There are two good reasons why books still matter and why institutes and places and times to write books remain important. One reason is that a book obliges you to think more systematically about the connections between the phenomena that are under study. And in an article, it's much easier to neglect all sorts of significant dimensions because you can reason as if all other things are equal, right? Standard analytical device, which is used in the social sciences as well, but which has more limitations in the social sciences than perhaps in some of the natural sciences, because we study phenomena for which the degree of interdependency is so great. And for that, books to explore these interdependencies, the changes, the variation in interdependence across context, books are perhaps somewhat more relevant than articles.
So you would also even argue that, you know, certain questions or certain disciplines demand a different kind of communication. So you would say books force you to deal with questions of a different nature or a different extent.
I think so. Perhaps not necessarily, because of course we can ask questions about interdependence and complexities in interdependence also in article form. But in fact, I would like to read a quotation,
Yes.
which is a little small follow-up on.
If it's a quotation from a book, it's
no, it's not a quotation from a book, but it's about a book. And it's in fact a quotation from Thomas Piketty, the French economist who has written about these issues of increasing inequalities and so forth. And in an interview, Piketty said the following, I think it's very succinct summary. Short articles, he says, can be useful, but in the end you see much more and you ask much bigger questions when you write books. When I wrote this book, so this is Capital in the 21st Century, I spent more time really thinking hard than I had ever spent in the 10 years before writing articles for economic journals, when in fact you sort of escape from the big and difficult questions. So end of the quotation. So this is, I think, an interesting issue and an important aspect of.
It also highlights another element that, you know, that book was a bestseller.
Yes, indeed.
And very few articles become bestsellers.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that is indeed another reason why I think books are important. It's also in bibliometric studies, it's been shown that articles very difficultly communicate across the boundaries of research specialties and disciplines, and books have a much bigger chance of doing this. And so that is, if you're interested in communicating across the borders of your research areas and so forth, then books are a particularly important medium, and that of course includes communication outside of the academy with people, publics outside of the academic world. And so this, and the possibility of contributing in the social science to the public debate. And so that raises the issue of what is called public social science, or social science work, which is at once discussed among peers in the academy, but also in the public sphere. And Piketty's book, indeed, is a perfect example of such a form of public social science.
Just ask June and Scott. Scott, I know you have written books. Something. Can you say something about the role of books in the natural sciences? Because I think it's somehow also kind of disappearing there, right? I mean,
I think you should ask June rather than
well,
than
mathematics
me,
is
because the question is really whether the young researchers are learning new subjects from books or from articles or from Google.
What has been your personal experience by writing a book?
My experience was that the amount of work compared to an article goes like the square of the number of pages.
Nicola, you want to say something about it? Is
yes,
that a universal phenomenon?
Of course, I mean, we have books and we have articles, and they both serve a specific purpose. And in terms of books, of course, the monograph is what we are looking at. And yes, it's an essential form of sort of research production in the humanities. Is the preeminent form of research production, I would say. But again, we do all of this. I mean, you can't choose one over the other. There is no way, in my view, to concentrate only on books. Although a number of people actually prefer the book form because, first of all, they can expand on a much broader territory.
But I mean, what I've observed from a distance, at least, in discussing careers of historians. I mean, often the unit that's being used in someone's career is the number of books, right?
It's the number of books.
It's a person
yes.
with one book person, a two book person.
I think there are even universities with one book tenure and two book tenures.
And
There's
the
no
size
zero
of and the
book
size
tenure.
of books, of course. No, there is absolutely no question that I agree with Johan that and with Piketty that we need to maintain the monograph as an essential form of production. But I would also say that a number of interdisciplinary work, for instance, is much easier conducted as an experiment. Also, perhaps at the article level than at the monograph level. Monographs are typically, I would say, less of a conducive to a collective effort. Yeah.
June, can I ask you, because perhaps not everybody knows, but mathematics is still very much a book field, right? I mean, in some sense, if you do the experiment, you look at offices of scientists, then clearly I feel the mathematicians often have the biggest libraries.
We love books, but I don't know whether this is a new phenomenon or not, but I have been advised many times, and I've seen people advising to young people not to write books. Not to write books, because in our field, most of the books are entirely devoted to communicating the known information to outsiders, not to delve into the deepest unknown fact. And people will prefer, and actually the university departments will prefer, to have someone with 10 publications in fancy journals rather than one book. So,
You think this is a good thing or a bad thing? Or?
I think this is a bad thing. So more credit should be given to those who will write books, but this is hard to implement in practice because people will count publications and not books. So in our field, 10 papers in annals, maybe. That's a definite tenure, maybe. One book, that's, I don't know. Depends on the book.
You should also know that most mathematic books are published by Springer. They're yellow, right? So one of the definitions of a mathematician is a person walking with a yellow book.
Yes.
I want to open the discussion to all of you. So we have seen a few ideas, the sense of equality, inequality, the use of the internet, interdisciplinary research, books. Any question, remarks that you want to add to it?
I just had a simple question. We talked about how the computer is an essential part of everybody's work these days, but I'm quite interested to know in the thinking processes that each of you use that don't involve a computer at all. Like what does that practice look like?
Do some of you tune out and have a day that you don't touch the computer, for instance?
Well, my litmus test for whether I'm using the computer too much is what I think about in the shower. And if I'm thinking about research in the shower, I figure everything's still okay.
It's also not very practical to use your computer in the shower, I guess. Some other reactions?
I can say a few things about. I think the computer is ubiquitous right now, and what we do without the computer, I still write quite a few things, drafts and so on, by longhand, and I take notes by reading books and so forth. But these are practices that perhaps belong to a different generation. I'm not sure that a student today would do the same, for instance, a PhD student and so on. So how much we can generalize on the basis of my experience, I've no idea. I cannot translate something, for instance, where I have dictionaries and so on using a computer. That's something I cannot do.
Good point. Carl.
You mentioned earlier Jim Simons conducts curiosity-driven philanthropy, and I'm curious whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, that's perhaps related, and I want to add to it. In some sense, Scott, and you talked about the more pronounced role of private funding. Also want to discuss whether that might be good for, in some sense, perhaps distinguish what kind of research could typically be funded by that. And just for instance, often it's said things which are higher risk, or perhaps where a donor or a foundation has a very clear goal. So can you say something about that? What the specific role of private funding is in the whole arsenal of research?
Well, first, my understanding of Simon's comment was that he did not think that curiosity-driven philanthropy was a good thing.
He's practicing it. He loves mathematics, which is terrific if you're a mathematician.
Yes, but he's not directing where the grants go. I guess I think there are advantages and disadvantages of both private philanthropy and philanthropy provided by the federal or state governments. I think the danger of private philanthropy is that certain directions of research are more appealing to typical donors, and therefore may get an unreasonable share of the pie. And of course, one example is research into health issues in medicine. I'm not saying that, of course, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Perhaps a simpler example from my own field is funding of telescopes. So if you look at telescopes in this country, the bulk of the largest optical telescopes are primarily funded privately. If you look at sort of square inches of mirror surface, something like 80% of the mirror surface available for US astronomers is privately funded. On the other hand, if you look at radio telescopes, they're just a lot less appealing to philanthropists because they're not on top of high mountains. You can't look through the eyepiece. And
the pictures are less pretty, perhaps?
Right, yeah. And they have essentially no private funding, and the field has suffered enormously from it. So, I think I guess the main thing I'd say is that you want a diversity of funding sources, both private and public, to give you as many opportunities as possible for a good project to be.
I want to underline this point of medical research. If you look at, I think the total expenditure on basic research in the US is 30 billion a year. Philanthropy is 2 billion, which sounds like a remarkable large number, but then actually if you see how much of that is biomedical, and actually often very, very directed, I think there's only a very small fraction I think it's something like 10, 15% that not biomedical research. Anybody else wants to react on this? No? Angelos, and then Ian.
I'm sure that philanthropically driven curiosity is better than curiosity-driven philanthropy. And this philanthropically driven curiosity brings me to the problem of funding of research, and not funding of the research that you have dealt in the panel, that is research that seeks to answer a question, but research that seeks to provide material for future reference. And a lot of research that we are doing is of this kind, has absolutely nothing to do with curiosity. Most of my own research, for instance, in publishing the Supplementum Epigraphicum Grecum, is not satisfying my curiosity. Just give 2,000 inscriptions in 1,000 pages every year to other researchers so that they will be able to do that. And this is precisely the kind of research for which we do not find any funding, or hardly any funding, and also the kind of research that academies should be doing, but are not doing as much as they should.
And you make the point that this, the benefits are sometimes really in for future generations.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yes,
it's,
yes.
I mean, editing a manuscript, publishing the results of an excavation that may consist in masterpieces, but may also consist in Ottoman pipes and broken pottery and so on. It's the curiosity of future generations that are going to profit from that.
It's a wonderful point. Any reactions to it? Yes? Yes? Kathleen, you want to?
Yes, thank you, Robert. I'd just like to say, following on Angelos's point, that those big projects are being very, very seriously compromised by, particularly in Europe, the trend for short-term funding.
Right.
They really don't like these projects. I'm thinking of the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, which is the biggest dictionary project ever, and it started in 1894, and they got to the letter R. And no Latin scholar can work without this thing. But now the funding is going to run out in 2025. We hope that it'll be renewed. But these short-term, this my presentism gig again, this short-term thinking is very damaging to these major projects of fundamental corpora for future generations.
Would you just kind of turn to that point? Because in some sense these huge literary works, these encyclopedias or dictionaries, etc., are in some sense the equivalents of particle accelerators for the humanities, right? So this is a massive project that many people. So perhaps you're almost saying that we need, perhaps in the humanities, there's a need of these projects that go over many generations and have much longer time horizons.
Yes, and are fundamental data for infinity, for the infinite amount of research that will happen in the future.
It's a great point. Any reactions to that?
Well, the reaction is that yes, the question really is how much of the share for research comes from private funding and how much comes from state institutions and state funding and so on. Because of course we cannot rely, as Angelos was saying, on simple curiosity. We need to go back to the fundamentals, let's say, of each field and see what we are building. I mean, the foundations really on the field are based on these very large projects. It depends on what period, what area, and so on. But any period has some of this. So I think too much private philanthropy is not too good.
Ian.
I just wanted to raise a point about, so using technology to do research beckons, I think, a very important question, which is, who's in control of that technology and what do they want out of that technology? So we talked about a lot about Google, and Google is a private company that provides this service, Google Scholar, where you can find all sorts of articles, but they're a company that wants to make money. So the question, what if Springer starts paying Google so that their articles pop up first in Google Scholar searches? And I think that's a really relevant point when you're thinking about directing science through funding, but directing science through the technologies that we're using and what the interests of the people who are making these technologies available are.
June, can you say something about it? To which extent, indeed, we are using these technologies? but we are not in control of them. And to which extent is that a danger, that in some sense you will be kind of directed in a way that, you know, in some sense adversarial?
That's a real possibility, but so far I don't think there has been any serious attempts with the ill intention to, say, by a Springer via Google. And as far as we are aware of such danger, I think nowadays we have the control in the sense that we have other means to use this information, this web of informations, not through Google, but maybe by something else. So,
Scott?
Obviously, there's plenty of evidence of Springer's ill intentions. It's just that they've focused on paper journals rather than Google so far.
Johan?
Well, I think there are two issues. One is conflict of interest, right? I mean, there can be conflict of interest, and there are lots of conflicts of interest, which I think are, for example, in the medical research, it's well known, it's very well documented. There's a sort of chronic problems with conflicts of interest between commercial interest and knowledge interest. So that's one aspect of the question. And the other aspect of the question is this time horizon. I think it's very important as well that there's an Italian economist, Mazzucato, who has written a book about the economics of research, and she shows very clearly that, for example, including for Google, for the internet, for Google technologies and so forth, the sort of initial long-term investments, far before they had commercial possibilities, this was mainly public funding. And then at a certain point in time, when the time horizon to commercial results is sort of within reach, then the private sector jumps in. In private philanthropy, it's a little bit different, of course. But I mean, as soon as commercial interests are there, the time horizon, she shows is very clearly. So this is a very important aspect, because exactly the private funding is on the rise, public funding is sort of relatively declining. And so that's a major issue, which has a lot of aspects. The corporate is an aspect, and there are many others as well.
I would like to come back on the issue of books, very briefly. Of course, a book is not only a written book, it's a book that is read, published, that circulates in the world. And of course, the conditions are changing all the time. And maybe there are also generational changes in the culture of reading books. So the question is, will we be able in the social sciences to write and publish books in the future, or is it a sort of luxury of the past that will disappear very soon? Because of course the constraints of the publishing world are more and more, are stronger and stronger on the publishing world, especially for academics. And of course we mentioned Thomas' book, but Thomas Piketty's book, but it's a real exception in our field.
You're entirely right, and there is in book publishing, I think, also a shift, for example, which is related, I think, to habits and to that graduate students today and postdocs today do not have in the social sciences the idea that they should have a library, for example, to have a library, to buy books and have a library. That's changed very much in the social sciences, so that inhibits, sort of, makes it more difficult. The other issue is that the publishing world has changed, and that there are now many publishers who publish books, individual books, collective books, which are merely for the library market. And, well, that has a certain use, of course, like Palgrave and Routledge and so forth and so on. But it's not the book culture what it used to be. And well, we'll see what happens, but it is an important aspect of the issue, sure.
One more last question. Yeah, Sarah.
So this is primarily for Nicola and Scott, but everyone as well, on interdisciplinarity and the results of it. Think about mathematical physics, psycholinguistics, art history, medical ethics. My question is about the role of the thought experiment and the case study in the future of interdisciplinarity, for example, between historical studies and natural sciences. It seems to me that we need an implementable, real-time model in ordinary language that is not just a matter of whim or chance or spontaneity, that there needs to be a structure for dialogue that produces a kind of new epistemology that would have non-trivial consequences in your disciplines. What do you think about the future of such a model, which does not yet exist?
What would you like to change, so to say?
Well, the challenges are institutional as well as in terms of our own training, the way we are socialized in the world of research and the world of academia are very different. So the institutional challenges are very, very difficult to overcome, I would say, because we don't have that kind of model. And what is happening, I can tell you what is happening in reality is the creation of this mushrooming, let's say, of little experiments here and there. There is one at Princeton University, there is one at Harvard University, there is one, more than one in Germany, where there are these research centers that bring together different people around typically a project which is financed typically by the university itself or the Max Planck Institute or some similar research center. And then we will see what happens with this particular model. So far, the research center or the sub-center of a bigger research unit are the only places, the habitat, let's say, the petri dish where these experiments are being performed. And then we will see whether we will have a better model than this one in the future. I hope so, but so far we are just experimenting.
Scott.
Well, while I agree with what Nicola said and with the sentiment of your comment, I do want to say that interdisciplinarity is somewhat like motherhood. That is, everybody's in favor of it, but there are different institutional structures in different branches of academia, some of which encourage interdisciplinarity not at all, and some of which encourage it a lot. And I think the proper question is not what structures we can put in place to encourage more interdisciplinarity, but what the right level of encouragement for interdisciplinarity is. I mean, the reason we have disciplines is that most research actually isn't interdisciplinary, and I think from what Nicola has said, the institutions that we're familiar with actually do a reasonable job at encouraging experiments in interdisciplinary research. So I would just caution that we shouldn't automatically assume that there are obstacles that have to be overcome for this sort of new research direction.
So I think I want to kind of wrap things up here. I want to thank all four panelists. I think it's terrific that I felt somehow everything that you were saying about what needs to change or what the things are that need to be preserved, that in some sense the Institute plays an important role because it's a place where you can actually come and write a book. It's a place where there is interdisciplinarity, I would say, at the natural rate of occurrence, in some sense, in an undirected way. There are plenty of opportunities to network and connect, and in terms of inequality or something, we are just looking at these bucolic circumstances, another place where we have to have serious complaints. So, and I think also the terrific thing is that this is a place to have these kind of conversations in a very casual setting. So, again, I think hand of applause for the four panelists. And I think this ends the academic part of our kind of end of term day. I think now we have to move slowly, if you want, to the other side of Fould Hall, where we'll have the evening program, which is no formal presentations all. I think it's just food and drinks. I think. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you.